Chapter 5: Crisis of the Distinction of Planes Model. The acceptance of the new Christendom position entails, of course, a rejection of previous approaches. It in turn, however, is criticized because of its position on the distinction of planes. In recent years, there has been a questioning of pastoral action and theology based on distinctions which, although they gained ground very slowly, did indeed contribute to the clarification of many problems. This crisis has become distinctly manifest on two levels: pastoral action and theological reflection. The pastoral level. As we have seen, the model which distinguishes faith and temporal realities, church and world, leads to the perception of two missions in the church and to a sharp differentiation between the roles of the priest and the layperson. This model soon began to lose its vitality and to become a hindrance to pastoral action. Two instances can illustrate this point. Crisis of the lay apostolic movements. The rise and development of an adult laity has been one of the most important events in the Church in recent decades. Although they foreshadowed a profound ecclesiological and spiritual renewal, the lay apostolic movements as such have nevertheless been experiencing for some time a deep crisis which it would be well to examine and analyze in detail. The crisis, indeed, provides us with a number of lessons and points for reflection. As we have pointed out, the distinction of planes approach held that the mission of lay apostolic organizations was to evangelize and to inspire the temporal order, without directly intervening. But the life of these movements overflowed this narrow and aseptic conceptual model. The movements, especially the youth groups, felt called upon to take ever clearer and more committed positions, that is to say, to take on themselves in greater depth the problems of the milieu in which they supposedly assured a presence of the Church. Initially, this change was presented as deriving from a pedagogical concern. The youth movements could not separate religious formation from political formation. The questions, however, went deeper. At stake was the very nature of these organizations. The fact that they took a stand on the temporal plane meant that the Church, especially the bishops, became committed in an area foreign to it, and this was not acceptable. Simultaneously, because of the very dynamics of the movement, the members felt compelled by circumstances to make ever more definite commitments. This necessarily led to a political radicalization incompatible with an official position of the Church which postulated a certain asepsis in temporal affairs. Therefore, frictions and even divisions were inevitable. Crises have occurred and spread. The lay apostolic movements, such as they are understood in the distinction of planes model, seem to have burned themselves out. Growing awareness of an alienating situation. The social problem, or the social question, has been discussed in Christian circles for a long time, but it is only in the last few years that people have become clearly aware of the scope of misery, and especially of the oppressive and alienating circumstances in which the great majority of humankind exists. This state of affairs is offensive to humankind, and therefore to God. Moreover, today people are more deeply aware both of personal responsibility in this situation and the obstacles these conditions present to the complete fulfillment of all human beings, exploiters and exploited alike. People are also more keenly and painfully aware that a large part of the Church is in one way or another linked to those who wield economic and political power in today's world. This applies to its position in the opulent and oppressive countries as well as in the poor countries, as in Latin America, where it is tied to the exploiting classes. Under these circumstances, can it honestly be said that the Church does not interfere in the temporal sphere? Is the Church fulfilling a purely religious role when by its silence or friendly relationships it lends legitimacy to a dictatorial and oppressive government? We discover, then, that the policy of non-intervention in political affairs holds for certain actions which involve ecclesiastical authorities, but not for others. In other words, this principle is not applied when it is a question of maintaining the status quo, but it is wielded when, for example, a lay apostolic movement or a group of priests holds an attitude considered subversive to the established order. Concretely, in Latin America, the distinction of planes model has the effect of concealing the real political option of a large sector of the Church, that is, support of the established order. It is interesting to note that when there was no clear understanding of the political role of the Church, the distinction of planes model was disapproved of by both civil and ecclesiastical authorities. But when the system, of which the ecclesiastical institution is a central element, began to be rejected, this same model was adopted to dispense the ecclesiastical institution from effectively defending the oppressed and exploited, and to enable it to preach a lyrical spiritual unity of all Christians. The dominant groups, who have always used the Church to defend their interests and maintain their privileged position, today, as they see subversive tendencies gaining ground in the heart of the Christian community, call for a return to the purely religious and spiritual function of the Church. The distinction of planes banner has changed hands. Until a few years ago, it was defended by the vanguard. Now it is held aloft by power groups, many of whom are in no way involved with any commitment to the Christian faith. Let us not be deceived, however. Their purposes are very different. Let us not unwittingly aid the opponent. Further, in the face of the immense misery and injustice, ought not the Church, especially in those areas such as Latin America, where it has great social influence, intervene more directly and abandon the field of lyrical pronouncements? In fact, the Church has done so at times, but always clarifying that this was a merely supplementary role. The scope and omnipresence of the problem would seem to render this argument inadequate in our day. More recent options, such as that offered at Medellin, have transcended these limitations and now require another theological foundation. In short, political options have become radicalized, and the specific commitments which Christians are assuming demonstrate the inadequacies of the theologico-pastoral model of the distinction of planes. The level of theological reflection. In a development related to these new pastoral experiences of the Church, contemporary theological reflection has also eroded the model of the distinction of planes. It has done so in two apparently contradictory ways. An entirely worldly world. In all the different responses to the problem we are considering, the world has gradually been acknowledged as existing in its own right. Autonomous with regard to both ecclesiastical authority and the mission of the Church, the world has slowly asserted its secularity. Acknowledgement by the Church of this autonomy manifested itself first with timidity and distrust, hence the expressions healthy, just, and legitimate autonomy which frequently appear in documents from the magisterium of the Church. But gradually, and especially in theological circles, the values and irreversibility of the process to which we now refer as secularization have become more obvious. Secularization appeared as a breaking away from the tutelage of religion, as a desacralization. This is the most common way of characterizing this process. Harvey Cox writes, "We have defined secularization as the liberation of man from religious and metaphysical tutelage, the turning of his attention away from other worlds and toward this one." This is how the process of secularization has historically been presented. It was an initial attempt to deal with the problem, valid albeit incomplete. There is a second and more positive approach to this subject, which is already suggested in the final part of the text quoted above. Secularization is, above all, the result of a transformation of human self-understanding. From a cosmological vision, humankind moves to an anthropological vision, due especially to scientific developments. We perceive ourselves as a creative subject. Moreover, we become aware, as noted above, that we are agents of history, responsible for our own destiny. Our mind discovers not only the laws of nature, but also penetrates those of society, history, and psychology. This new self-understanding of humankind necessarily brings in its wake a different way of conceiving our relationship with God. In this sense, secularization, and this has been recalled often lately, is a process which not only coincides perfectly with the Christian vision of human nature, of history, and of the cosmos. It also favors a more complete fulfillment of the Christian life insofar as it offers human beings the possibility of being more fully human. This realization has engendered efforts to search for the biblical roots of secularization, efforts at times somewhat concordist. Biblical faith does indeed affirm the existence of creation as distinct from the Creator. It is the proper sphere of humankind, and God has proclaimed humankind Lord of this creation. Worldliness, therefore, is a must, a necessary condition for an authentic relationship between humankind and nature, among human beings themselves, and finally, between humankind and God. All this has important ramifications. In the first place, rather than define the world in relation to the religious phenomenon, it would seem that religion should be redefined in relation to the profane. The worldly sphere appears, in fact, ever more consistent in itself. This is Bonhoeffer's world come of age, Mundig, the source of his anguished question, how can we speak about God in this adult world? On the other hand, on a very concrete level in which we are particularly interested, if formerly the tendency was to see the world in terms of the Church, today almost the reverse is true. The Church is seen in terms of the world. In the past, the Church used the world for its own ends. Today, many Christians and non-Christians ask themselves if they should, for example, use the influence of the Church to accelerate the process of transformation of social structures. Secularization poses a serious challenge to the Christian community. In the future, it will have to live and celebrate its faith in a non-religious world, which the faith itself has helped create. It becomes ever more urgent that it redefine the formulation of its faith, its insertion in the dynamics of history, its morality, its lifestyle, the language of its preaching, and its worship. The secularization process is reaching Latin America insofar as the history of humanity becomes unified and global. It is true that some features, and especially some interpretations, are once again only a simple reflection of the European scene, the fruit of a kind of demonstration effect. However, this should not mislead us. There is a deep-rooted movement. Its characteristics have been poorly studied. Because it is peculiar to Latin America, this makes it no less real. Latin Americans, by participating in their own liberation, gradually are taking hold of the reins of their historical initiative and perceiving themselves as artisans of their own destiny. Moreover, in the revolutionary struggle, they are freeing themselves in one way or another from the tutelage of an alienating religion which tends to support the status quo. But the problem is complex. It is not a matter of achieving the same end by other means. Latin America is not purely and simply passing through less developed stages of the secularization experienced in Europe. It could rather be said, if we may borrow an expression from another discipline, that in Latin America we are witnessing a secularization process which is uneven and combined, a rhythm different from Europe's, coexistence with other ways of living religion and of experiencing its relation to the world. The possibility of effectively concretizing the potentialities of the gospel and the churches in order to contribute to the liberation of Latin American persons. All these factors suggest an original process which defies any simplistic conceptualization and all extrapolation. A consideration of this process helps explain many attitudes and crises of persons who might not be fully aware of their root causes. The challenge of redefinition with regard to an ever more adult world also faces the Latin American Church, but has very peculiar characteristics. 1. Call to salvation. The temporal, spiritual, and profane sacred antitheses are based on the natural-supernatural distinction. But the theological evolution of this last term has tended to stress the unity which eliminates all dualism. We will recall briefly the high points of this process. Concern for preserving the gratuitous quality of the supernatural order led to the formulation of the doctrine of pure nature. This completely separated human nature from divine grace. It attributed to human nature not a strong orientation toward grace, but rather a bare lack of repugnance for it. There was no interior desire for communion with God, but rather simple passivity. The supernatural was fundamentally alien to human beings, a perfection superimposed upon them. This viewpoint, which goes back to Cajetan, a less than faithful interpreter of Thomas Aquinas, dominated Western Catholic theology for a long period. Not foreign to it are an attitude of distrust of the world and ecclesiocentrism, that is, a view of the Church as exclusive repository of grace, which since the 16th century until a short time ago were both found among Catholics. The inadequacies of this position produced impasses which necessitated searching for other answers. The move forward was toward a distinction, not a separation, between the natural and supernatural orders, based on the infinite openness of the human spirit to God. In this view, there is in human nature something more than a lack of repugnance for entering into communion with God. It is a real desire. Some were fearful, however, of not being able sufficiently to assert the gratuitous character of this encounter, and so there were timid references to an eventual and contingent natural desire mediated through the orientation of human intelligence to being in general, ens in commune. According to this position, this desire only proves that the vision of God is a simple possibility. Its contingent realization does not affect human nature in any significant way. The polemical dialogue between these two positions deepened the reflection and issued in a fruitful return to the original thought of Thomas Aquinas. Now there was a mention of the presence in human nature of an innate desire to see God. This is at the other extreme lack of repugnance. Indeed, the orientation towards God is viewed here as a constitutive element of the human spirit. Every act of knowing implicitly contains the desire to know God. This desire defines human intellectual dynamism. The grace of the vision of God thus culminates a profound aspiration of the human spirit. Human beings fulfill themselves completely only in this communion, dependent upon God's free initiative. The natural and supernatural orders are therefore intimately unified. The tendency in this development we are describing is to stress unity beyond all distinctions, but this is still to consider it on a metaphysical, abstract, and essentialist level, involving moreover complicated and ultimately fruitless academic arguments. Once the way was cleared, however, for the elimination of dualism, the problem took a sudden new turn. A significant stage was introduced with the recovery of the historical and existential viewpoint. In the concrete situation, there is but one vocation: communion with God through grace. In reality, there is no pure nature, and there never has been. There is no one who is not invited to communion with the Lord, no one who is not affected by grace. This point of view was first supported by Yves de Montjoie and Henri de Lubac. The novelty of this view, although thoroughly traditional, and certain ambiguities in language provoked strong reactions. Rahner continued thinking along these lines, and in order to avoid the difficulties encountered by the authors mentioned above, proposed the idea of a supernatural existential. That is, the universal salvific will of God creates in the human being a deep affinity which becomes a gratuitous, ontologico-real determinant of human nature. This is the central and enduring existential condition of man in the concrete. Blondel, whose influence de Montjoie and de Lubac have explicitly acknowledged, had attempted something similar. He characterized the human state as transnatural. Devoid of supernatural life, human beings are nevertheless oriented to it by necessity. They are highly stimulated in relation to this vocation. After the loss of the initial gift, they do not fall back into an undifferentiated nature. Rather, they retain the mark of the point of insertion ready and, as it were, in potency to receive the restitution they need to attain their real and obligatory destiny. This perspective, which transcends scholastic argumentation and expression, is now generally accepted. Historically and concretely, we know humanity only as actually called to meet God. All considerations not based on this fact are speculations devoid of any real content, but an even more precise formulation has been sought in an effort to be faithful both to the gratuitous quality of God's gift as well as to its unified and all-embracing character. With certain important qualifications, this actually had been the line of theological thinking until the rise of the doctrine of pure nature in the 16th century. Today, this perspective is being revived, due at least in part to a different philosophical and theological context which places more value on what is historical and concrete. The initial and fundamental issue, however, is the unity of the divine vocation and therefore of the destiny of the human person, of all persons. The historical point of view allows us to break out of a narrow, individualistic viewpoint and see with more biblical eyes that human beings are called to meet the Lord insofar as they constitute a community, a people. It is a question not so much of a vocation to salvation as a convocation. The rediscovery of this single convocation to salvation has caused the crumbling of barriers erected diligently but artificially by a certain kind of theology. It reaffirms the possibility of the presence of grace, that is, of the acceptance of a personal relationship with the Lord, in all persons, be they conscious of it or not. This in turn has led to the consideration of an anonymous Christianity, in other words, of a Christianity beyond the visible frontiers of the Church. The advent of a Christendom without the name has been proclaimed. These expressions are equivocal and the choice of words poor. It will be necessary to refine them so that they will point with greater precision to a reality which is itself indisputable. All persons are in Christ efficaciously called to communion with God. To accept the historical viewpoint of the meaning of human existence is to rediscover the Pauline theme of the universal lordship of Christ, in whom all things exist and have been saved. These developments have manifested themselves in the gradual forsaking of such expressions as supernatural end, supernatural vocation, and supernatural order, and in the ever-increasing use of the term integral. Martelet rightly observes regarding Gaudium et Spes, this term integral is perhaps one of the key words of this constitution. In any case, this is how the Council constantly characterizes its way of approaching the vocation of all persons and of the whole person. Integral vocation, for example, in Gaudium et Spes number 57. See also numbers 10, 11, 59, 61, 63, 64, 75, 91, and Ad Gentes number 8, and Integral Development, Populorum Progressio number 14, are expressions which tend to stress the unity of the call to salvation. The most immediate consequence of this viewpoint is that the frontiers between the life of faith and temporal works, between church and world, become more fluid. In the words of Schillebeeckx, the boundaries between the church and mankind are fluid not merely in the church's direction, but also, it may be said, in the direction of mankind and the world. Some even ask if they are really two different things. Is not the church also world? Metz asks, The Church of the world, in a certain sense, the Church is the world. The Church is not non-world. But there is another important consequence. This affirmation of the single vocation to salvation, beyond all distinctions, gives religious value in a completely new way to human action in history, Christian and non-Christian alike. The building of a just society has worth in terms of the kingdom, or in more current phraseology, to participate in the process of liberation is already, in a certain sense, a salvific work. We are faced on the one hand with the affirmation of an ever more autonomous world, not religious, or in more positive terms, a world come of age. On the other hand, we are also faced with this single vocation to salvation which values human history in Christian terms, although in a way different from that of the past. Caught in this pincer-like movement, which was not exempt from misinterpretation and sloppy expression, the distinction of planes appears as a burnt-out model with nothing to say to the advances in theological thinking. Both on the level of the concrete commitments of Christians in the world and on that of contemporary theological thought, the distinction of planes model was thus inadequate. If at a given moment this theology stimulated and supported the presence of Christians in the building up of the world, today it is rigid, lacking in dynamism in the face of the new questions being posed, and therefore no longer viable. Whatever was valid in those distinctions can be maintained only within a radical change of perspective.